All right, hello everyone. It is now noon Central Time, so we're going to get started with today's webinar. My name is Megan Weber. I'm an extension educator here at the University of Minnesota, and we are getting ready to host a carp management and lake restoration webinar featuring Przemek Bajer. He's a research assistant professor at the University of Minnesota's Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. I'll go over a couple of quick housekeeping items before I turn everything over to Przemek to give his talk. First, everyone's going to be muted for the duration of the webinar. We won't be turning that off. So if you do have any questions, enter those into the chat box. You should see a little screenshot of what the bottom of your screen would look like where you can enter chat. Go ahead and put those in at any point during the webinar. If you have questions, just type them on in. We're going to be keeping track of all the questions that come through, and we'll work our way through those once we get to the Q&A session. If you have any technical issues, you can either use that chat and you can send a message to the panelists or directly to Pat, or you can send Pat Mulcahy an email at mulcahyp@umn.edu, and Pat will do his best to help troubleshoot whatever the issue is that you're having. And finally, we will be recording this webinar. So if you would like to come back to it and view it later or share it with colleagues, there's a link below, and we'll show this again, where you can subscribe into our YouTube channel to be notified once that gets posted. We'll also be sure to send out that email. So with that, I think we'll take this and I'll turn it over to Przemek so that he can introduce himself and begin his presentation.
All right, great. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Przemek Bajer. Like Megan was saying, I'm a research assistant professor here at U of M and MASERC. And I'm also the owner of a startup company called Carp Solutions, which sort of grew out of the research that we have been doing at MASERC. And it focuses on developing new methods for carp control. Let's see if we can. I'm not able to advance my slides. Okay. There we go. Okay, so this is about common carp and lake restoration. I've been working on this subject for about 12 years, and primarily in Minnesota, and I hear that we have a broader audience today than just Minnesota. So that's kind of exciting. I hope that you will find this interesting. One housekeeping item. So today's talk is about the common carp, not the silver or bighead carp. I hope nobody is disappointed in that. So the common carp is obviously one of the oldest and probably most destructive invasive fish that we have in North America. A few words about their history and where are they from. They are a large minnow species from Eurasia. This area around the Black Sea and Caspian Sea is their home. And they were introduced to North America more than 100 years ago in late 1800s. It was quite an effort to bring the common carp to this continent. And it actually started with the European settlers who really wanted to have their fish from back home here in North America. And you can actually still find the old letters that people were writing to the congressman requesting that they bring the carp here, and they did, because back then nobody knew what invasive species were, so people were not anticipating that this could have sort of unintended consequences. So they brought over 300 carp from Germany, and they kept them in Washington, D.C. for 2 years to produce young carp. And then the young carp were stocked throughout the country from specially designed railroad cars, like you can see in this photograph. This is Pennsylvania Fish Commission. I don't know if we have anybody joining from Pennsylvania, but you guys can be proud of that effort, I suppose. And it worked great. Now we have carp everywhere in the US, and they are probably one of the more abundant fishes in a lot of lakes, especially in shallow, productive, warm water ecosystems. So this is the current distribution of the common carp. And like I was saying, my work focuses primarily on Minnesota and surrounding states. So carp is not only, a big problem in North America. They're kind of one of the most invasive fish around the world. So there's this list of 100 world's worst invasive species, and there's a few fish species on that list, and common carp is one of them. So this is just an example of carp management in Tasmania, where they have 2 large lakes that were invaded with the common carp, and this is a unique effort because they actually were able to fish them out from one of those large lakes, which is, I think, maybe the only example where carp were eradicated simply through extensive fishing, often guided by telemetry and targeting spawning habitats. But it's an example of successful eradication without using poisons, which is interesting. Common carp are called ecosystem engineers. Again, there's one of those species that are able to fundamentally modify ecosystems they invade. And this video will kind of show you how and why. So they're large fish, and they like to dig in the bottom when they're looking for food. And by doing so, they disturb lake sediments. They eliminate or physically uproot aquatic macrophytes. They release the nutrients from the bottom of the from lake sediments into the water. And then in turn, the lakes turn from vegetated lakes with clear water to turbid water lakes without vegetation, with high nutrient concentrations and high algal blooms. This is one example of that. This is Hennepin and Hopper Lake in Illinois, where we did some work more than 10 years ago. This was a shallow lake right by the Illinois River that was restored by the Wetlands Initiative. And what they did was they eliminated the carp by using rotenone, which is a toxin. And you can see the lake when the carp were eliminated, and all of these kind of gray areas, these kind of shaded areas indicate aquatic vegetation. This is a shallow lake, so covered almost entirely by aquatic vegetation. And then the carp invaded, and a couple of years later, the lake turned into this, which was essentially a system with, muddy brown water with no aquatic plants. And this has been documented throughout the Midwest and other parts of the country many, many times. Lakes without vegetation are poor habitat for waterfowl and other organisms. So carp are a significant driver of declines in biodiversity and ecosystem function. And this is just one example. So this is from the same lake, from Hennepin Hopper system. It shows on top, you see the carp biomass from the time they invaded the lake. And it was year after year was increasing, a sharp increase, 2004, 5, 6, and 7. And at the same time, steep decline in aquatic waterfowl that was using the lake. And again, this is quite typical. This has been shown for a lot of ecosystems in the US and elsewhere. Like I was saying, because the carp disturb lake sediments, they often release or are believed to release significant amounts of nutrients from the lake sediments to the water column. The top 1 or 2 inches of lake sediments are really rich in phosphorus and nitrogen. So physical disturbance of those may lead to increases in nutrient concentration in the water. And on the other hand, carp management or carp removal might lead to decreases in nutrient concentrations. This is one example. This is Lake Pickerel in Minnesota. This is southern Minnesota, all right, around Albert Lea, highly agricultural area. This is a shallow lake. And you can see carp were eliminated in 2009. This is not my data. This is from Shell Rock River Watershed District. And what they did was they built an electric barrier at the outlet from the lake, and so that the fish could not move into the lake. And then they treated the whole lake with rotenone, which is a fish toxin. And by doing so, they eliminated the entire fish community, including carp. But carp catch rates were very, very high before the rotenone treatment, before 2009. And then they restocked the lake with native fish after 2009. So now the lake has native fish, but doesn't have carp. And as you can see, the phosphorus concentrations dropped more than twice after the carp were removed. And that decline actually persists through today. So it's been several years now. This was recently verified by others. This is a paper by Luke Ginger and others that looked at multiple shallow lakes in Minnesota. And what they were doing is, as you know, the shallow lakes can shift between the clear water state with vegetation to the turbid state without vegetation. And those shifts are often driven by carp or fish like carp. So what they wanted to do, they wanted to quantify how much nutrients and other things in lakes change when the lakes shift from clear to turbid state. And as you can see here, when the lake shifts from the clear to turbid, the fish biomass increases. Well, that's not surprising. Macrophyte abundance decreases, and this is, a severe decrease, more than 10 times. Chlorophyll A, which is algae, increases. This is 8 times, 8-fold increase. Total nitrogen also increases. They figured out about 3 times on average. And phosphorus also increases about twice on average. So again, similar responses like the ones I showed for a pickerel lake. And interestingly enough, there's another paper from Denmark where they looked at 36 shallow lakes. And Denmark is an area with productive soils, kind of flat terrain, shallow productive lakes. So similar to a lot of Midwestern areas. And what these guys were doing is they looked at 36 lakes over 22 years, which is a pretty big study. And what they showed was each one of those dots represents an individual lake. And they showed what happened once the fish biomass in those lakes were reduced by 200 kilograms per hectare or more, which is a significant reduction. And as you can see, this is the one-to-one line, meaning if the dots were along this line, there would be no change. But they were seeing declines in total phosphorus. And this red line indicates 30% decline. So a lot of those lakes, phosphorus decreased by 30% or more, and it lasted for many years. Nitrogen also decreased by maybe 30% or more. And you can see the differences between individual lakes, but on average, there was a decent decline. Whoops, go back. And Secchi depth increased dramatically. This would be 10 times, so more than 2 or 3 times. Suspended solids decreased and chlorophyll A decreased. And they had another graph where they showed cyanobacteria, which is the harmful algae, and they decreased as well. So this was an interesting study. The point I'm trying to make is that, carp management and benthic fish management in general can be an important tool for lake restoration, especially for those who are interested in reducing nutrient concentrations and restoring habitat for waterfowl, for example. And again, there are often substantial differences between lakes, but overall, benthic fish like carp can be a significant driver of that process. So in Minnesota, we have issues with excessive nutrient concentrations, especially in southern parts of the state. And this map on the right-hand side shows phosphorus loads. So red means very high. And this tends to be an area where carp are also very abundant, which is the map on the left-hand side. We did an estimate a few years ago trying to figure out how many of these lakes are impacted severely by carp, and we estimated about 70%. So given the evidence that I just shown in those previous graphs, it's likely that carp may be significant drivers of nutrient concentrations in southern Minnesota. And it's an interesting sort of positive feedback loop because carp often tends to do well in lakes that are eutrophic to start with, but they increase the nutrient concentrations even more. So perhaps carp should be included in sort of more broadly defined nutrient reduction strategies. And as many of you know, there is a nutrient reduction strategy for Minnesota, but carp are not mentioned in it. And including carp might actually boost the overall effectiveness of those strategies, including boosting the effectiveness of on-land strategies such as cover crops and things like that. So now I want to talk a little bit about managing or controlling common carp. And the approach that we have been trying to develop is integrated pest management. We borrowed this from other applications, for example, agriculture. And the way this works is first you want to understand the life cycle of the species and understand why it's successful, and maybe there are some weaknesses in the life cycle. And then you want to develop specific tools that target those weaknesses. So it took us a while to kind of figure out the life cycle of carp in Minnesota. And this is sort of a graphical representation of that. So let me walk you through it. So let's start in the summer. And in the summertime, you know, this is carp in lakes. They kind of broadly dispersed, happy, swimming around, feeding. Then winter comes. The carp have this interesting behavior when they form really tight, dense aggregations under the ice. You can see us here using telemetry to find those aggregations under the ice. We don't know why they do it, but those aggregations can be remarkably tight, where all the fish from the whole lake are, you know, in one or two schools. Then around April or so, these winter aggregations will break and the carp start spawning migrations. Carp in many systems spawn or moved from deep lakes to shallow marshes to spawn. These are partial migrations, meaning that in some lakes, only 10 or 20% of the fish migrate, and in some lakes, almost 100% migrate. But these migrations are highly synchronized in time, and they're actually quite remarkable. And the reason why they migrate is that a lot of these shallow marshes that they go to, at least in Minnesota, winter kill, meaning they're covered by ice and snow, and because of that, they often run out of oxygen, and the fish, native fish in those places, die off. And when the adult carp swim into those lakes, those shallow marshes from other lakes, they find perfect spawning habitats. Shallow, warm, productive, and no native predators that could eat their eggs or larvae. So they spawn in the marshes, and then the adults come back to their lakes pretty much right away, a couple of weeks later. The juveniles take a slightly different path. So they start as eggs and larvae, and if there are no predatory fish in the marshes, such as this bluegill here, these are very common predators, the eggs and larvae develop into fry or juveniles, and these juvenile fish will stay in those marshes usually for a year or two, and then they will start moving back to the lakes where the parents came from. And that's how this sort of migratory cycle begins, because then they grow up, mature, and they begin moving back to the marshes they came from. Through some genetic analysis, my colleagues demonstrated that the carp actually home to the habitats that they came from. It's an interesting behavior. And in many lakes, you can have several streams flowing into a lake, but the fish will always go back to the same stream that connects to the marsh where they've been born. So somehow they can distinguish those different spatial connections. So this life cycle sort of identifies several potential weaknesses. And the first one that I want to mention is biocontrol. So by doing experiments in lakes and marshes over many years, we've demonstrated that if the lake has, or a marsh has, abundant sort of healthy population of native fish, including bluegills, the carp do very poorly in those systems. Native fish, such as bluegills, eat eggs and larvae of carp, and although carp spawn in those places, the young don't generally survive. So the best thing you can do to control carp populations is to support or maintain or enhance native, healthy native populations of small predatory fishes such as the bluegill. And in some cases, that's very hard to do because, at least in our part of the world, a lot of marshes are super shallow and they winter kill no matter what you do. But in other places, lakes that are say 10 or 12 feet deep, you can put aeration systems under the ice and they will provide enough oxygen for bluegills to survive. And then they're able to control carp reproduction. So biocontrol, that's the most effective, natural, and cheapest way to go. Another weakness is those aggregations under the ice. And those have been exploited by commercial fishermen for decades. This is a photo that shows that process. So what happens is we usually tag 10 or 20 carp with radio transmitters, and we go out and find them. And when they school tightly, the commercial fishermen come in with their gear and they try to catch those aggregations under the ice. This can be very effective. However, it is limited to lakes with bottoms that are clear of rocks or trees or things like that. Because seine nets are big, they're often 1,500 to 2,000 feet, something like that. And if you pull a net that size across large areas of the lake, and if the net snags, the carp escape. And they can actually learn once you try to target them like that a few times, and they escape and they learn and they avoid the nets. But nevertheless, this is a good strategy if you can use it. Then these are a couple new things that we've been experimenting with the last years. One is conditioning or training with food or bait. So this is the oldest trick in the book. Carp are known for feeding on grains, like corn, for example. And they're also known for being smart, meaning that you can train them. So we've been doing experiments to test that idea, meaning can you train carp to aggregate with food? And is that species specific? So this is one of those experiments. This is Long Lake, I believe about 250-acre lake right in the Twin Cities. And in that one, this is Drew and Morgan, we're helping that effort. We tagged a bunch of carp and a bunch of native fish, and we wanted to see if we can attract carp to the bait specifically. And we tagged those fish with pit tags. Those are those small microchip tags that you can use in your pets, for example. They last forever. And we put an antenna around the bait. So whenever the fish gets near the bait, it's detected. So we know who is visiting the baited sites. So we tagged over 400 carp and I think over 800 of native fish. So bluegills, bullheads, white suckers, largemouth bass, bowfin, bigmouth buffalo, basically whatever we could catch in that lake. And we set up a baiting station by somebody's property on a dock. We have a computer with a reader box, and by those sort of green posts in the water, you can see that on the bottom there is a loop antenna and a bait bag with corn. And as soon as we started baiting, the carp showed up. So this shows which fish were visiting the baited site. And we started with no baiting around August 22nd or so. We just kind of seeing who was visiting that site kind of randomly. So there are small numbers of carp, which are red, some white suckers green, and some bluegills, which are black. And then we started baiting on September 10th. And almost immediately, the numbers of carp went up and the native fish remained low and after time actually disappeared. So as I was saying, we tagged 450 carp, and within a few days we're attracting about 30 to 40, one day 60 carp to that one site. So that's about 10% of the population. But the point was that this was very species specific. We saw no other fish really using the baited site extensively. So the take-home message here would be, if you had multiple sites like that, you could attract most of the carp in the lake over really, really small areas and maybe catch them. This is what it looks like underwater. So what we do is we put corn in mesh bags. So the carp can suck the corn through the mesh, and we show up every day and lift the bags and see how much food is gone. And by doing so, we can sort of measure the consumption. But as you can see, we're not seeing native fish attracted to corn. It's just a bunch of carp. And in this particular lake, 10% of the fish, that's about 2,000 carp per day, that were attracted to this site. And this is middle of the day, which is when the aggregation is the weakest. So at night, there's even more fish there. So then, because this attracts carp in large numbers, we developed special nets that can be used around those baited sites. We call them box nets. So the way it works is you can sort of see the bait pile here, this white spot. And the net is just a big square or rectangle. It's usually 30 by 60 feet. It's got a mesh bottom and mesh sides and just lays flat on the bottom. We bait the fish over the net for a few days. And then when the fish are trained, we lift the sides of the net up and we catch the carp inside. And then we use those floating kind of booms here to put them underneath the net, and we kind of roll all the fish to one side, all the carp, and then we roll them on the boat. So in this particular case, this is a 1,000+ carp that is caught in those 30 by 60 nets. So this is an interesting approach because A, it's selective, B, it can be used in places with obstacles on the bottom because the nets are fairly small and you don't move them through the lake. And C, lake residents can be involved. The people who live on lakes generally like, getting involved in carp management efforts. And the one thing that they can do is they can monitor the amount of consumption and then actually do the baiting. So that saves a lot of time and money. So they train the fish, and when the fish are trained, we show up to remove them. And finally, this is sort of the last new method that we have been working on. It is developing automated or largely automated systems for removing carp during spring migrations. Like I was showing on the live history slide, carp migrate in large numbers, and these spawning runs are actually quite remarkable. This is a photograph from our study site, which is Rice Creek, again, right here in the Twin Cities. You can sort of see the drone photograph of carp that are moving upstream. And here in the water, we have those yellow floats. You can barely see them. This is an electric guidance system that we use to guide the carp into a trap. This is another shot of our field site. So you can kind of see the carp here migrating. They're breaching the surface of the water, so you can see the backs here. And you can see more clearly the electric guidance system. So it's positioned at an angle. It's got positive and negative electrode. And as the fish are trying to move up, we're directing them into this trap. So the first year we tried kind of a small trap design. That didn't work. And the next year we changed that. I'll show that in a second. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, let me back up a little bit. We have electronic pit antennas across the stream here, and then also upstream here, whoops, I'm sorry. And then also at the entrance to the trap. So we know exactly how many carp are migrating on any given day, and we know how many of them are going through the barrier, how many of them are being directed into the trap, and so on. So this is the system that we use. Again, it's the PIT technology, passive integrated transponders. Again, it's the same thing, those microchips that you put in your pets. And there is typically an antenna on the bottom, just a loop made out of wire on the bottom that is connected to a reader box and solar panels. And those things are nice because they often run for the whole season with not much maintenance. And they provide real-time data. So you know right away how many fish are migrating. This is data from Rice Creek, our study site. So last year, migration started on, this is April 7th and 8th. And then it spiked to 150 carp per day. Then it declined because it was cold. It was actually snowing. And then it picked right back up to 450 carp per day when the weather warmed up. So having this data, you can know how many fish are migrating, you know what's going on. So Again, we're trying to direct those migrating fish into a trap. So like I was saying, first, small trap didn't work. Then we tried a bigger trap. You can sort of see it here. We built this big fence that was 80 feet long and 15 feet wide. And we were directing the fish into this fence. So this is dead end for them. They can go in here, but they can't escape. And first, so we had them all in this fence. We started removing them with nets. We removed over 4,000 just to kind of prove the point, but that was labor intensive. This is just a video that shows you what it looks like when those fish aggregate in our fence. You can see them, this whole side of the fence is jumping carp. When we show up, like when we leave the site in the afternoon, the day before, those 2x4s are near the water. You show up in the morning, they're all pushed up because the fish just keep jumping and jumping, like this guy. Bottom line is we can direct significant numbers of carp into the trap. But again, removing them with nets is kind of labor intensive. So we figured out this new method. Let's see if I can advance this. This new method, so this is our site again. We have the electric guidance system. We're guiding the fish into the trap. Just do the animation. So the fish are trying to go up, but they can't. So they can swim inside the trap. And then inside the trap, we have no net, but we have additional electrodes that can be turned on in sequence. And they push the fish down towards the downstream end of the trap. And then the two last electrodes actually zap the fish, like so. And then the fish swim with or float with the current onto a conveyor belt. And there is another conveyor belt that moves them on land. So again, this is meant to be automated with not much labor. So these are our sort of electrodes we were testing last year. And this is our conveyor belt that we were testing last fall. And the initial tests were very promising. We were able to convey more than half of the fish that we put in this fenced enclosure in one trial. And we will be doing a full test of this technology this spring. So if this works, this will be really sort of hopefully high-tech, kind of high efficiency, hopefully not that much labor approach. So in summary, carp dominate many lakes in Minnesota, especially shallow lakes, and throughout the Midwest. They can eliminate macrophytes, release nutrients from bottom sediments, increase turbidity and harmful algal blooms. Carp management can lead to immediate improvements in water quality. Like I was showing, Pickerel Lake from southern Minnesota, and a point that I forgot to make there was that this is highly agricultural area and nothing has changed with land use. But phosphorus concentrations declined but more than twice after carp removal. So this shows that in some lakes, fish may be perhaps more significant drivers of nutrient concentrations, at least in short term, than land use. And I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't worry about land use, but I'm trying to say that we should perhaps make benthic fish management part of nutrient reduction strategies that also include land use management. And then there is this integrated pest management strategy that has been advancing fairly rapidly. And many elements are already available and being used for management: commercial seining, biocontrol, the bluegill sunfish idea, baiting and removal with those specialized nets, and then the electric guidance system with the removal scheme that we will be perfecting this spring. There are also some success stories. I didn't have time to talk much about that, but at least in our area, there is a Riley chain of lakes where the carp were driven down to less than 10% of their biomass about 10 years ago, and they're still low. And that included commercial seining, some barriers, some biocontrol. Phelan chain, same example. More recent example, Typo Lake, where the biomass was reduced by 40% just by using barrier and the baited nets. And Owasso Lake, it's another example of that. So there are some success stories. So with that, I want to thank our collaborators and funders. There's a lot of people who took part in this effort. You know, like I was saying, I've been working on this stuff for more than 12 years, so it's even hard to figure out, you know, how many names to put on this slide. Actually, would have been probably a couple dozen more names that should have been on this slide. And our local funders and partners, watershed districts. So we're grateful for the funding. And I believe that's all I have. And now we'll move on to the Q&A session.
Yes, great. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us, Przemek. It was a really interesting presentation. And we actually have quite a few questions rolling in. So
all right.
we'll get started right away. So the first question, we have this in a few forms. I'm going to try and combine a few questions into one. But we have a number of people asking about bycatch. So both along the lines of if there are species that are impacted by the electronic guidance system that you have within the net, as well as the one going across the stream, if you're seeing any impacts to native species there, and if any or which maybe ending up kind of on that final conveyor out?
Yeah, good question. Yes. So northern pike is a species that sometimes migrate together with the carp. Northern pike usually migrate very early in the season, and in many lakes, their migration is pretty much over before the carp migration starts. But in some places, there's an overlap, and actually Rice Creek is where they overlap. But the catch methods we use are non-lethal. So again, you know, even though the fish are pushed around, so to speak, or guided using electricity and then end up on the conveyor belt, they are not harmed and they could be released. This is kind of like electrofishing that is, you know, often used for surveying fish. So once the fish are on the conveyor belt, they can be sorted out and the native fish can be released and the carp can be euthanized, harvested.
Great. And then there was the same question about the seine netting that was done like in the winter or spring during migration. So just without the electronic system or with just the baiting and the seine netting, do you see that same type of issue or?
So, one thing I forgot to mention about the electric guidance is that, you know, the migrations last maybe 3 weeks or so, 4 weeks. So we only use it for a few weeks every year and then you can turn it off. Now moving on to this question about bycatch when, you know, when we do winter seining or box netting. Winter seining targets carp aggregations, but the seines cover a large area because you kind of have to start far away from the aggregation so you don't spook the fish and you move the net through the water. So a lot of native fish end up being caught in those seines. They are released. So it is somewhat, you know, selective, but, you know, a lot of the fish that end up being caught in the seines are not in the best health. But nevertheless, they can be released alive. In terms of box netting, at least in our area, this effort is extremely selective. For whatever reason, corn is very, very selective and attracts only carp. Only one system that we worked in, channel catfish, were also attracted. But usually more than 99% of the fish we catch are carp. And then, you know, this is not a lethal method. And the fish actually don't spend in the net a long time. So the native fish that are caught are released.
Great.
But it's very, very few of them.
Awesome. Okay, and then, sorry. So we had a question going back to when you were talking about the biocontrol method, if there's, you'd mentioned bluegill sunfish being one species that can help minimize carp populations. Are there other sunfish species or species in general that can also be helpful in that regard?
We don't really know, but we've looked at, you know, we're lucky because Minnesota DNR has been collecting data from hundreds of lakes for more than 20 years. So when we looked at those correlations, bluegills stand out as the main biocontrol species. And then we actually did multiple experiments using enclosures and even whole lakes where we small lakes, like 1 hectare, where we put carp, adult carp in all of them, and we put bluegills in half of them. And there was a big difference in terms of the number of carp fry produced. So we know that bluegills are very important, and we know that they eat eggs and larvae because we did those experiments. But I suspect that other predatory fish, such as crappies or perch or bass or pike or walleyes, I'm sure they contribute as well. They most likely focus on larger carp, the fry and the yearlings that survive. But we think that having this sort of layer of small predatory fish that forage on carp eggs and larvae is really, really important. And without them, it's probably difficult for the larger predators to control carp reproduction.
Oh, great. Okay, so I'm going to move on to, we have a few questions about implementing the system that you showed towards the end. So some of them we're starting with the baiting, both the type of bait that you're using and how frequently or how much bait you need to do to kind of get the process started.
Yeah, so the bait we use is cracked corn. And depending on the lake, sometimes actually you need a lot. 100 pounds a day per net is not unusual. We will be doing an experiment this year where we're trying to figure out if we can train the carp using less bait, which I think is possible. But for now, we use cracked corn and we use quite a bit of it.
And how long do you need to start the baiting process before you can start the removal?
Sure. Within a week, you should be able to attract the carp, and 10 days is certainly long enough. And when we do those efforts, sometimes you're not sure if you have enough carp for this method to be effective. When the carp population is not that dense, they tend not to be very interested in corn because they have a whole, other things to eat. So what we do pre-baiting. Sort of test where we just put some bait in the lake and check it after 3 days. And if it's not gone, then that means that this is not a good lake for box netting.
All right. There was a question similar to that, so I'm just going to move along to this one, where someone was wondering about the information that you would need about a lake to begin a carp management program, whether it be this one or a different way, or even that if carp management is going to be appropriate for that lake.
Yeah, so I probably should have included that in my talk. We were able to define the threshold for carp management. That's usually around 100 pounds per acre. And whether you are above or below that threshold can be assessed fairly quickly by using boat electrofishing. We published a paper on that, and maybe in follow-up I can send a link to that a few years ago, where basically you count the number of carp you catch per hour, and you plug that number into an equation, and that equation will tell you the biomass of carp in your lake. It's an estimate. But you will know pretty quickly if you are below the threshold, say 80 or 70 pounds per acre, or above the threshold. And if you're in the 2 to 3 or 400 pounds per acre, then it's almost certain that you can attract a lot of carp to, using bait.
Okay. And then what factors within the lake might you use to decide how much area, like how far away can the fish be from a bait station for them to aggregate from there? Like, how do you need multiple bait stations per lake, or? That's
a great question. So we are actually just looking at that. We did an experiment last year where we had 2 and then 3 stations in 2 lakes, and the lakes were about 200 acres. And initially we had 2 baiting stations sort of across the lake. And that showed that most of the fish were visiting only 1 station, meaning local stations attract local fish, meaning you would need to have multiple nets per lake to attract, a lot of carp. And we think that maybe 8 to 10 nets, like we'll be trying this approach this year, where we have 10 nets in that lake, and we'll see if we can attract most of the population. But with 1 or 2 nets, it's very, very difficult to attract all the carp into that one spot.
Sure. So in a situation like that, then, for example, where you're not able to get a large number of the carp out in any one season, is there a way to avoid, or have you noticed if there is a response or an adaptation by the fish to avoid that system in future seasons or attempts?
We don't know that yet, but we're collecting a lot of data on individually tagged fish. It's possible. I may have a better answer for that next year. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some learning effect, but on the other hand, the way the box nets are designed is that once the sides go up, the fish generally tend not to escape from those nets like they can, for example, from seine nets. So once they're inside the net, they are not likely to escape, meaning they're not likely to learn how to escape from those nets.
Great. Okay. So a question that has come up a lot, I'm sure you've heard this one before. We have many people wondering what happens to all of the biomass that you remove from the lake.
Right. Yeah, people ask that question a lot. Well, I think there's a lot of potential uses for carp biomass. And I think that the carp biomass should be used for something productive. We are not doing that yet. We are at the stage where we're really trying to develop the tools to remove the carp selectively and effectively. And maybe, in a year or two, we'll be in a position where somebody should really take a look at, what to do with the biomass. We are not a commercial, entity. We don't sell the fish. So we're just focusing on developing capture methods.
Okay. All right. So I have a couple questions then. Talking about nutrient management, one of them was wondering about when you were talking before about without any changes on the landscape, having seen this as a really great way to start to remove nutrient. So do you think that the carp removal would be best as a prerequisite before management, or is it a secondary factor after other nutrient loading issues are resolved or improved?
Well, I think they should be done in parallel. I think that certainly on-land strategies are critically important. But I also think that if you have a lake that is totally dominated by the carp, even if you improve land use by a lot, and if you reduce, nutrient runoff, that lake will still be dominated by the carp, and it will probably not recover until the carp are removed. So you really have to do both of those things, I think, at the same time. It's just finding the right balance, right? And I should also say that the impacts of carp on lakes are not the same across the board. Some lakes, especially shallow lakes, are impacted more than deep lakes. So that should be taken into consideration as well.
And someone was actually asking about the shallow and deep lakes as you're defining shallow lakes for the purpose of management. Can you say more about how you're defining a shallow lake and if some of these strategies might work for a deeper water body as well?
Right. That's a good question. So I define shallow lakes as lakes that don't develop thermal stratification. So for practical purposes, in our area, those are usually 12 feet or less. Lakes where substantial areas of the bottom can be covered by aquatic macrophytes. And on the other hand, deep lakes are, lakes that typically develop thermal stratification in the summer and where aquatic macrophytes are primarily restricted to the shoreline, the littoral zone.
Okay. And then we have a couple of kind of carp biology or ecology questions. Do you know how quickly or how easily carp can evolve or change with different annual cycles?
No, I don't. What we do know is that the carp can be long-lived. We did a lot of aging analysis, and we find fish that are over 50 years old quite often. And looking at the spawning migrations for multiple years, we see that they show the same behaviors every year. So if there is a connection between a lake and a marsh, they tend to go through that one year after year, even though we put the barriers. So we haven't seen any adaptation yet where we block one connection and they start exploring another connection. I'm not saying it's not possible, but we haven't seen that yet or any other adaptations.
Okay. And do you know at what age range the carp are beginning to breed in Minnesota?
Yeah, usually they mature at about 12 inches. And let's see, that would be usually in the third year of life.
Okay. And then one more on kind of biology or ecology. Do you know why carp populations tend to stay high if they're so dependent on the lake ecosystem for nutrient or food? So like, does it seem strange that their populations are staying high when they're kind of eating up the available food resources?
All right. So, they will hit a ceiling eventually. And in our area, I would say that 400 to 500 pounds per acre is about carrying capacity. You typically don't see higher biomass than that. And the one thing that will happen in those lakes is that the carp will reach high density, but the individual fish will remain fairly small. So even, the adult fish that may be 10 or 20 years old, they're usually 3 to 4 pounds, 16 to 18 inches, something like that. And in lakes with lower densities, they're usually 6 to 8 pounds. So there could be big differences, which means that once you start removing them, you can reduce the numbers quickly, but the individual fish will start growing in size. So you have to account for that.
Sure. Okay. And let's see. So in relation to implementing a program like this, how would someone begin that process? Is that starting through, for example, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, or how would someone kind of start that?
Well, we've been working a lot with watershed districts. I think it's helpful to have an entity that has a watershed-wide view of the ecosystem because carp are rarely sort of confined to one particular lake. They're quite mobile, like I was showing, the spawning migrations. So it's good to work with an entity like a watershed district where you can sort of take a more comprehensive look at the entire system, not just the individual lake.
Right. And is there a way for someone to do their own assessment of the carp population on a lake, or would they need to bring a professional in?
Well, that would be difficult because to do the assessment, you really need to do either boat electrofishing, so you would need to have an electrofishing boat, or you do mark and recapture analysis where you mark some fish and you catch some back, and usually have to use different method for catching and different for recapturing, so that's even more work and equipment. So I think for individual people to do assessments would be difficult. There was some effort a few years back to maybe use eDNA to figure out carp biomass, but those methods don't exist yet.
Okay. So then looking at long-term benefit and cost of implementing something like this, someone was wondering what the potential cost versus long-term benefit of this type of management approach might be, and how often would you need to go back and do another removal effort in order to maintain densities that would maintain that improved water quality?
Yeah, good question. So the cost versus benefit, right now the cost is still pretty high because we are essentially pioneering and developing those methods. I don't want to use the solar panel technology where once you figure out technology, you can scale it up and the cost decreases. But I think we may be dealing with something like that where the methods that we use every year become more and more and more efficient. So the cost per fish captured I would expect that it will decline. In terms of but I guess putting things in perspective, removing carp from a lake is probably similar to alum treatment of lakes. People have experience with that. So it could be still pretty significant. I mean, they're not easy to manage. And the second part of that question was how often, right, you have to manage. That really depends on the lake. I was giving examples of the success stories, Riley Lake, for example, Riley Chain. In some cases, it's actually pretty easy. For example, if you have a bunch of deep lakes and there is only one shallow marsh, that is the nursery. Once you document that and understand that, you can block off the marsh with barriers, for example, and that cuts down the reproduction. And then you can remove adults with seining or box nets or the spring migration stuff. And these efforts will be long lasting. If you don't have production of young carp, then adult removal does not need to be conducted more than maybe once every several years, maybe once every 10 or 20 years. On the other hand, if you have a lake that has extensive connections to multiple shallow marshes, or maybe a lake that is a marsh itself, where partial winter kills or summer hypoxia occurs occasionally, and you cannot maintain strong bluegill and native fish populations, carp will be able to produce young within those lakes or within adjacent marshes. And if you're dealing with high production of young, then management becomes much more difficult. Not saying not possible, but much more, you would need to manage them basically year after year, and the cost would increase as well.
Okay. So is there a percentage of the population that kind of tips the balance in being able to have a sustained management approach?
Right, so you want to drive the biomass below 100 pounds per acre. So, if you're starting with 400 pounds, you have to remove 75% to get to 100 or less.
Okay. All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. There's quite a few that came in. But I think I've seen this question pop up a couple times where there's a few people who live on a lake that have both curly leaf pondweed and common carp, and they're noticing that there tends to be high abundances of both, and they're wondering why that is. If carp tend to eat the aquatic plants, why the curly leaf seems to be what's persisting.
Yeah. So they don't tend to eat the plants. They just physically disturb the bottom, and the plants cannot sort of set roots in the sediments. That is a good question. So there could be a couple explanations. One is the biomass of carp may not be super high. Sometimes people see carp spawning in curly leaf pondweed, and it seems like there's a lot of carp in the lake because they're splashing on the surface. But actually the biomass may not be very high. It could be, for example, in the moderate range, say between 100 and 200 pounds per acre. And in that scenario, often we see the invasive plants being more abundant, because we suspect that, if that lake is sort of partially disturbed, the sediments, it's possible, we hypothesize that the invasive plants like milfoil or curly leaf can do best of all plant species in those systems. And I know there is actually a paper that Dan Larkin is publishing now that sort of presents those correlations, that in those moderate carp biomass lakes, you tend to see more invasive plants.
All right, great. So that is the last question that we have time for. So I apologize to those of you who we weren't able to get to your question, but Przemek was kind enough to offer to answer some of these in a written format. So we did record this webinar, and if you can advance the slide one more for us. We did record this webinar, so we will work on getting that closed caption, and it'll go up onto our YouTube channel. Once that's available, we'll share the available answers along with the recording. So you will get an email notification once that is available. So the final housekeeping items as we kind of wrap things up. So on the remaining slide, you can see some contact information. So if you do have a question directly for Przemek that wasn't in that question list or didn't get answered, his email address is showing there. If you have a question for us about the webinar series or other programs, anything like that, the recordings, just you can shoot us an email at aisdetectors@umn.edu, and either Pat or I will answer that question. I put the link up again for how you can subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to be notified there when the recording is available. As I said, we'll also send out an email to everyone who registered for this webinar, and it'll also have the responses to those Q&A questions on there. So I think with that, we can sign off and give one more round of thanks to Przemek for sharing all the information they had today. It was very interesting. Thanks.
That was fun. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.